Great. Thank you everyone for signing in. Welcome to this week's Entwine exclusive. My name is Arielle Sokoloff and I'm the Senior Engagement Manager at JDC Entwine. It's really wonderful to see so many new names to our exclusive. So for those of you who might not know us yet, Entwine is the young adult platform of JDC, the Joint Distribution Committee, the world's leading Jewish humanitarian organization. And JDC works in over 70 countries worldwide. We started the Entwine exclusive series back in March to give you a behind the scenes look at how JDC and its partners are responding to the COVID-19 crisis, and also to connect you to the global Jewish world. A few housekeeping tips before we dive into our conversation. We have Miriam here on the chat. You can feel free to post questions in the chat or in the Q&A at any time throughout the session, and we'll do our best to get to as many questions as we can at the end. Miriam is also going to be posting articles that you can use to supplement the learning and all of the resources our panelists are sharing. We will also be sending out those articles in a follow-up email at the end. So to our topic, this Saturday is World Refugee Day, and JDC and Entwine are very proud to be partnering with over 100 Jewish organizations that are a part of the 70 million campaign being hosted by Olam. This is a campaign that encourages people to take action to support refugees through donations, advocacy, learning, and volunteering. I strongly encourage you to click the link in the chat so that you can pledge to support this campaign as well. This is a topic that is especially important to explore today, as refugees, asylum seekers, displaced persons are particularly exposed to the consequences of COVID-19 and its resulting economic impact. On today's webinar, we're going to focus specifically on COVID-19's impact on asylum seekers in Israel. We have a great panel with us today. We have Michal Ben Dov, who is JDC's Director of Strategic Partnerships, and Monim Haroun, who is a Sudanese social activist living in Israel. And I'm particularly pleased that our conversation will be moderated by Shauna Ruda, who is a dear friend and mentor of mine. Shauna worked at JDC for close to a decade, supporting the building and scaling of Entwine. She also worked in Nepal, Turkey, and in Israel. In Israel, she worked specifically with asylum seekers and refugees. And since 2018, Shauna has worked with major corporations to support efforts that close the inequality gap for vulnerable communities. So really excited to learn from all of you today. And Shauna, I'll turn it over to you to take us into our panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Arielle. It is really exciting to be here today with Entwine. I certainly feel particularly lucky to be with Monim and Michal. As a granddaughter of refugees, as a Jewish woman, as somebody who cares a lot about these issues. I just wanted to start the panel with a few different points for framing. One is that I want to acknowledge for the United States citizens that are part of this conversation that this is a really significant moment in the United States for migration. Our president's new executive order and the Supreme Court vote that just happened regarding Dreamers in DACA have certainly surfaced how important migration is, but like with most overarching social issues that are surfacing during the coronavirus, our migration situation is not new. It's not unique to the United States, as we'll find out in this conversation. And there are actually more displaced people in the world today than the entire population of the country of France, to provide perspective. So, and migration is certainly disproportionate in terms of its impact to people who carry a number of marginalized identities: Black and brown people, women and girls, people with disabilities, people who are already from low-income communities. That's why it's super important that JDC Entwine is hosting this conversation, because its mission is really about preparing young people and rising leaders to address 21st century global problems. So, and I also want to note that today when I speak to Monim and Michal, I'll be referring to the population of Africans who are seeking protective status in Israel as asylum seekers and not as refugees. Both because Monim, I believe, felt it was important to acknowledge this real nuance, and because the term refugee is a legal term. And it's a legal term that was given under the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees, and then to the 1967 Protocol. It's a legal status that comes with protection. And why it's important to talk about asylum seekers is that it's really, this protection is rarely granted in the world, and it's rarely granted in Israel. For example, only 6 people were given that protective status in Israel in previous years. So this is important because status validates a story for people publicly, and it holds meaning, and it says my experience matters, my experience is real, but in fact the average wait time for this permanent protective status is usually around 25 years. So with that framing, I am super excited to step back and talk very little and turn it over to Monim to introduce yourself and share your story with all of us.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you for organizing such an important platform. I'm really honored to be here with you. So my name is Munim Harun, as you said, Shauna, and I'm from Sudan, Darfur. I was born in 1989 in a small village in Darfur, where we had a very beautiful and wonderful life with friends, families, everyone love each other. Sadly, that beautiful life was disturbed and crushed by a Janjaweed militia in 2000 when they came to attack our village. Was the beginning of the waves of genocide in Darfur. So I had to leave the area and move to another place within Sudan. And later on, I got accepted to Blue Nile University. I'm just jumping because it's a pretty long story. Yeah. So later on, I got accepted to study electrical engineering in Blue Nile University. It was also the time that I became an activist, a political activist against the Sudanese regime. I guess because the circumstances that I went through led me to realize that there's something wrong. There's something not well, because during my school time, I was studying with other kids that are coming and going back every day from their families, from the one that they love. They have a better life that I used to have. They are living they have a full security, no fear for their lives. So I was wondering why that we are the citizens of the same country. We're supposed to have equal rights. I should be with my families, being with them, study there. The government should provide school and hospitals and other services that they have. But I couldn't find answers for that. So later on, when I got accepted to the university, I started to understand. So the only choice I had, it was to act in order to change the situation. So I attended to a student organization that the organization is calling for democratic country, liberal country that is treating all citizens as equal, because Sudan is multi-religious, multicultural country, but sadly all regimes that ruled the country since independence from the British colonization, they only wanted to create an Islamic and Arabic country. That means they repressed and oppressed everyone who is not a Muslim and who is not an Arabic or is not coming from Arab origins. So also what they did is they wanted to eliminate the African cultures. They started with cultural elimination. That's mean you cannot call your kids based on according to your culture. That mean if you are non-Muslim, there is certain positions that you cannot situate within the country. So there was a discrimination against everyone who is not Muslim or an Arabic person. So yeah, this was the this was the main mission that I got in, and still today I'm working and fighting for that, for having a better country. So my activities put my life in real danger. I had no choice but to flee the country. So in 2012, I fled to Egypt, then to Israel. The journey was frustrating, difficult, harsh, and at some points even heartbreaking. I actually, at some point, I felt that it was a mistake to flee the country, because it was actually at the border between Egypt and Israel, the treatment that some people got in front of my eyes from the Bedouins in Sinai, and I couldn't talk. I, I could no, I couldn't say any words to defend them, and it was really disappointing and frustrating for me, because I used to fight for my own rights, for others' rights, and I got to the point that I felt that I have no power. So yeah, but luckily I managed to enter Israel. Sadly, there's others who couldn't. They lost their lives on the way. Some of them got shot by Egyptian military, the border, and some of them by the Bedouin. And yeah, so I was lucky to enter Israel. Yeah, so in June 2012, I entered Israel, and it was after such a long journey. And when we got to Israel, when we entered Israel, there's one of the moments that I will never forget. We have been shot by Egyptian military. Walked for almost 9 hours. 30 tired, collapsed totally. And when we get to Israel, so we were really tired, and we couldn't know what to do. But we heard a voice, someone saying welcome. We looked, and it was an Israeli soldier saying welcome. It was a very passionate, emotional moment for me, especially, and I guess for every Sudanese who grew up in a country that used to be very anti-Semitic against Jewish people. Used to tell that how Jewish people are bad, and only show the picture of Israeli soldiers killing Palestinians. So at that point, for me, it was a breaking point that changed everything. That everything bad they told me about Israel and about the Israelis, about Israel soldiers. So he said, welcome. We start to run toward him. He said, wait, we'll come to you. They came and took those who were injured to the hospital, give us food, water, and yeah. So I guess I'm speaking to many others when I'm saying that we have a tremendous respect to Israeli soldiers. Yeah. So yeah, after that, they transferred us to Interior Ministry, and um, we I think at that point the parliament just passed I think it was a third amendment of the anti-infiltration law that is basically said that everyone who entered Israel illegally should remain in jail for 3 years, then be deported back. Yeah, so I was put in jail for 1 year and a half, but luckily I wasn't deported back. And yeah, so today I'm here, a student at Hebrew University, studying political science and business administration, third year student. Also continuing activism for asylum seekers communities in Israel, and also doing some efforts to change the situation in Sudan, that we could be able to go back, and also for those whom we have left behind to have to live in a better situation and conditions.
Monim, thank you for sharing your story. And I think it's so important for all of us to understand that when we meet someone in one specific moment, there's an entire lifetime that comes before them. And with refugees in particular, or asylum seekers in particular, you know, this is your current reality, but there was so much in Sudan that happened before this, so much in your journey, so much that you're learning. You speak so many languages perfectly. So there's an entire lifetime that comes before the people that we meet face to face. And I really appreciate you illuminating that for us. And I wanna also give Michal the opportunity to do the same thing and to illuminate for us how she ended up in her role at JDC Elka.
So first of all, thank you. And it's a pleasure being with everyone. And I see some friends on the participant list, and it's exciting to be here with you. And Monim, thank you. And for those of you who heard him speak English, I told him this morning, his Hebrew is maybe even better than his English.
That's correct.
Right? And
Yeah.
I am so impressed. I can't even tell you how talented you are just by being able to communicate like this in so many languages. And as you said to me this morning, I was, you know, it really stuck with me. You said that I told Monim, I know people who live in Israel for for decades and don't have the level of Hebrew that that Monim has. And you said, well, maybe they didn't have to learn it and they didn't have to do it in order to survive. And this is something I needed to do. So you have very, very talented survival skills, that's for sure. So I'll say a little bit about JDC. You know, I also kind of am a granddaughter of refugees, like yourself, Shauna. I think many of us are. And in a lot of ways, JDC is an organization that is so I'm so happy to be working for an organization that does work with refugees in a lot of places in the world. But, you know, up until recently in Israel, JDC didn't do so much for the asylum seekers population, not because we don't think it's a very important issue and topic. It was just another one of the big social issues that Israel needs to deal with. And I think it was one of our board members that brought it to the table and said, JDC the organization that really was there, you know, after in the camps after World War II and helped refugees reach or help them and aided them in the Jewish world, how can we not be doing something about this population in Israel as well? And thankfully, we stood up and we took on the mission. And I'm saying this is a partnership, a real true partnership, not only of JDC Israel, but you know, the American Jewish community and the board members that sometimes push us also in Israel to do the things we do in JDC Israel. And we took on the situation, and we decided that we are going to try to understand what are the biggest needs of the asylum seeker population in Israel, and where JDC has an added value, and what we can do to maybe try and change the situation or help the situation. So in JDC Elka, we call it, we take care of the system, because we believe that better systems provide better services that in turn provide better lives, or highlight or improve the quality of life of everyone. And you know, the JDC in Israel went through a whole strategic process, and these words, you know, every single word we thought about. And when we talk about everyone who lives in Israel, all the residents in Israel, we don't talk about the citizens of Israel, because we do think about other people living in Israel that we want to touch and we want to help, hopefully, through the things that we do. And this is thinking about the asylum seeker population. It's also thinking about Arabs in East Jerusalem that are not citizens of Israel, and other populations among us. So that's at least the JDC theory. And as you may know, JDC in Israel, everything we do almost partners with the government. And that is, on one hand, a huge benefit, because the government can make real impact, and the big funding obviously is the government. And sometimes it's also a hurdle, because there's things that the government does not want to touch. There's political issues, and the asylum seekers topic as a topic was a problem for the government for a few years. So it became a problem for us to deal with it, because everything that we do, we need to partner with the government. And here is where, and so JDC Israel, I'm telling you just the asylum seekers story of JDC Israel today in COVID, but there's other stories to be told. I want to leave time for a conversation. But we had started, as I said, looking into the situation of the asylum seekers, this time without the government. We said we would get a task force together of the people involved, some of the NGOs. There's a lot of NGOs working in the field, people like yourself, Monim, and other people that we wanted to gather together and start looking at the big needs of the population and where, again, we could be helpful. And we started seeing that actually a lot of the things happening in Tel Aviv is okay. There's a lot of organizations dealing and supplying services for the population living in Tel Aviv. And we were going to focus actually on the different populations outside of Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, in Haifa, in Eilat, in Petach Tikva, in other centers. And that's where we were going. And we were going to learn from a lot of the things that are working well in Tel Aviv and bring it out to the other municipalities. And this is pre-corona. And at this point, we were really working below the radar of the government, and trying to find the partners that we would be able to start working with. And we actually got some very refused by some of the municipalities that didn't feel like they wanted to partner with us about this topic. And then Corona happened, and I'm jumping ahead, Shauna, I hope it's okay. Corona happened, as you know, and as we all know, I don't think anyone in the world has not been impacted. But Monim will say by himself in a minute, probably, about the population that really was hit so quickly, so drastically, immediately. What was the asylum seeker population, because obviously many of them are employed in the lowest paying jobs with tourism and with restaurants, and those are the things that immediately close, send them home, and they don't have any reserves, okay, and anywhere that they can, you know, take money, even for food and medicine. And this is where we were able, and again, Monim, you can describe the situation better for the population, but I'll tell the JDC angle of it is that we knew that this is a situation that we must address immediately. And we went to the government, and the government also understood that under this emergency situation, we need to give a response. And we were very quickly, it took about a month, but this is quick in governmental bureaucracy terms, we're able to set up a fund of right now 20 million shekels. This could grow depending on the needs, to give out money, just money for food and for rent to everyone who needs it within the population. And the novelty of actually being able to set up a fund, by the way, a little bit of philanthropy, not a little bit, substantial philanthropic money with government money together, which is new, that partnered together, and were able to give immediate response. And through this system that we needed to now distribute money to everyone that was eligible for it, we now were able to register and get a lot of data that no one has. The government doesn't have for sure, the municipalities don't have. And we were able to gain collaboration of both government ministries that had not wanted anything to do with this situation, and also some of the cities that are now collaborating with us. So as they say, you know, when you're given lemons, make lemonade. I don't think the situation is good right now for you, Monim, and everyone, but hopefully for you particular it is, but for your population. But I think that that I'm hopeful we will be able to provide more help moving forward. And I was very happy to see that we did get some collaboration from these organizations that were totally against it up until today.
Thanks for that, Michal. And what I really hear from the JDC perspective and from you, and knowing about how these issues are addressed, is this is a long haul. The relationships that JDC has been able to establish in the country with the government over the last, you know, century are really the relationships that were made possible this huge pivot. And so I think for the audience, and certainly for myself, a really big takeaway is how do you start to create those stakeholder relationships early on with the people you're voting for, with your community, with leaders who you know have influence, because, you know, this moment in time has brought out particular vulnerabilities, and having those pre-existing relationships is what helps people navigate these really challenging times. And I also wanted to surface a few themes that I'm hearing from both of you about the current state of migration, and we'll turn it over to Monim. You know, when we think about communities of asylum seekers, refugees, and those that are forced into migration, we think about people who might have jobs that put them at risk, that might not have access to ongoing housing, that might not be able to go to public authorities because they're worried about their status. These are just, you know, ongoing issues that without Corona exist. And Michal certainly spoke about your strengths, Monim, from your conversation this morning in terms of languages, but I want to know, as both an individual and a community member, what are the strengths you're drawing from to help you navigate this time and to also support your community?
Hi. Thank you again, and thank you, Michal, and for the your organization, GDC, and for the great job you are doing. Actually, you have. Yeah, you might not being involved in helping refugees before, but you arrived in such a critical time for us, and it was really helpful. And actually, yeah, the Israeli government denied several times to create a better condition for asylum seekers in Israel. But I do appreciate it, and I think we all appreciated what they did during the coronavirus, or what we are going now, deciding to support asylum seekers financially in order to survive this hard time. Yeah, so as you mentioned, Shauna, about the asylum seeker situation in Israel, I think the main challenge that we are facing in general is the lack of status. Actually, Israeli government has no clear policies toward asylum seekers, how to treat asylum seekers. And I think this is the main problem. The other thing is, I think Michal mentioned it before, that is the issue is politicized, that is become a political issue that that we cannot, the government cannot try to find a solution without fixing the political consequences that they might face later on. So, as I said, the lack of status is the main problem that is the asylum seekers are facing, because once somebody has no status in Israel, he has no access to medical services. He has no access to many other things that the government is providing for its citizens. So that's why when this coronavirus broke out, the asylum seekers were the first society to be impacted by coronavirus, because people have no savings. Also, because the government decided to pass a law that is putting sanctions on asylum seekers, that they will take 20% of their salary after reducing taxes. So that led asylum seekers in a normal situation to barely be able to afford their basic needs. So they have no way to save money. So when this coronavirus came, almost, or let's say over 70% of asylum seekers were got vacation without payments, which mean that while other Israeli citizens are getting social benefits or unemployment benefits, asylum seekers are not eligible to get those benefits. So they left with nothing to survive. So the strengths you asked about, I guess when we realize that or for me as a person, I guess is something that I came with for such a long time, since I was a kid. When I was separated from my mom and from my family, I realized that how I realized the importance of helping those who need help, because I really wanted, when I was a kid, when I needed help, to find someone to understand my pains, my needs, and start helping. So for me, it was something that very obvious as I saw it. And by the way, I'm not alone. There's many of other community, young, wonderful leaders from asylum seekers community, whether Eritreans or Sudanese, who stood up to help the community.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And yeah, you really spoke to the protective factors of your family and your community behind you. And I think that's something certainly that the Jewish participants on this call probably relate to. I rely certainly a lot on my community for my own strength and my own power. So thank you for sharing that. I wanted to briefly step back just for a moment, understanding like the general context of Israel, and was hoping that Michal could sort of shed light on the trajectory of all of this that happened. You know, Monim had mentioned that you came to Israel in 2013.
2012.
2012. Great. I knew it was one of the years that I was living in Israel working with asylum seekers. I want to just hear, and sure the audience wants to hear a little bit about, like, how did we get here? How did we get to this specific moment in time, and maybe like take a step back and bring us to the current context that we're in?
So quickly, I'll go through this. You know, between 2006 and 2012, there were a lot of asylum seekers that came in the path that Monim came through. A lot of them, many of them through Egypt by foot and crossed the border. And suddenly in Israel, you know, they're from having almost no population like this, okay, and it's different in the United States, I think, because in the United States it's you know, it's a much bigger border, and with Mexico and with other places, so it's a different situation. But suddenly Israel, you know, found itself dealing with this situation, okay, which they really, I think, haven't given, you know, enough thought to up until then. And there were thousands. Okay, and you know, I always say I'll put my personal opinions aside, but people in South Tel Aviv that were living in more of the poorer neighborhoods, of course, because the social were suddenly feeling that they were being you know, they were being surrounded by all these people. And there was a lot of tension over this, over these thousands of people that were entering Israel, and Israel really didn't know how to handle it. Monim said, spoke about being put in jail. Afterwards, there was a big, this is before Chulot, Nachon Monim, this is not Chulot.
Right. Yeah.
Afterwards, Israel tried to deal with it in a different way, in a detention camp, and really without, I think, a solid policy. And this is all these years, the asylum seekers kept coming in, so the population grew and grew. Up until, I think it was 2018 or 19, where really the borders were closed and they could not enter anymore. And then Israel now today is actually dealing with those people who live here already or who've made it in here. We're talking about something close to 31,000 adults, if I'm not mistaken, mostly Sudanese and from Eritrea, and a few more thousands of children that some of them were born here. By the way, the children do go to school. There was a Supreme Court ruling that said that children need to receive education, and they're going to school. I was actually in Ra'anana, which for those of you who know Israel is one of the sort of nicer or more upscale cities in Israel, and we did go there to distribute the cards, the pay cards for the asylum seekers that live there. There's about 300 that registered to receive the money that we were distributing, and they said that they were living in the community. Most of them are in jobs, you know, in the restaurants or cleaning either hospitals or places like that, or cleaning homes, but they live there and they send their children to school. So at some point, Israel sort of said, okay, we're not letting anyone enter anymore. And now we need to deal with whoever's here, but they're not really dealing they're still not dealing with it. Okay, there's no policy, like Monim said, and this is maybe, you know, it's a new government. We haven't had a government for a long time, over a year, and I don't know what will happen next, but maybe there is an opportunity here, especially again, since we realize that this is a population that lives amongst us, And here they were impacted so hard by the coronavirus, but they need to receive services, or else, this will be, it's something that the government will need to take care of anyway. So.
Yeah, thank you for providing that context. And I'll just sort of close out by asking Monim to give us an answer to one more question. It's clear that the coronavirus is asking us to imagine a new world for ourselves, because it's unsustainable to expect that people who are in situations where they can't return home and their lives are not sustainable in their current locations. It's become impossible, and we want to address those issues. And I think so many of us on this call are looking to build and imagine a new way of approaching the world and a new way of honoring humanity. And I'm looking to you, Monium, to provide us with some suggestions on how to do that. And would love for you to close us out by both talking about the activism that you're doing now, like those very tangible things that you're doing right now that we can join in on, and also to help us think about what are the next steps we can take to reimagine the world with you and in support of all of the people that are forcibly displaced in the world.
Just let me maybe elaborate on what Michal said about the asylum seekers situation in Israel, and at the same time answer your question. I think one of the main difficulties that we are facing here in Israel is also how Israel define us as asylum seekers. And I think this is a problem, because even those who are willing to help us, from I'm talking about the political parties or political figures, they are getting stuck with this definition, because Israel defines us as infiltrators. This word in English might have had no other meaning, but in Hebrew it has a historical connotation, which is very problematic. That is the legal status that used to define those who entered Israel to commit an act of terrorism against Jewish people. So it is very hard work that how the government define us. So for me, I think one of the first step to create a better situation and condition for asylum seekers is to try to convince the government and those who are in a position of
making policy.
Policy and decision makers to define us as asylum seekers and refugees, and not infiltrators. And also because for me, it was really important, and going back to why I speak a good Hebrew, because for me it's always I have in mind always those who I left behind, because we are a minority who able to leave the country and survive, but there's millions of people who live still in Sudan in displacement camps. So those are victims of genocide and horrible violations of human rights that committed against them. So for me, it was really important that the Israeli community, Israeli society, and the world listen to my story, the story that represent millions of people, in order to fix their problem, to try to help them, to change the situation for them. So I think for me, talking about our situation as asylum seekers and refugees in Israel, in the context of coronavirus. I think this virus has did a very change a very important thing, I think, in our minds. I see right now more and more Israelis receive us differently. They start to see us as humans. And what the government did for giving money for us, I think, is a very important step, that they start to realize that these are people who have who need to live in a certain conditions and situations. And I think we need to to work on this, to use the momentum and work on it, that we all understand that we're all human. We're all human. We can live in better condition without all this hatred and wars and all these other crazy things that we are creating once there is no coronavirus, once we are living in a normal situation. So I think we can adapt all these values that we gain during this crisis and adapt them as a normality.
Shauna, and I do want to end with one sentence. I want to commend our organization that we work with in JDC. I'm not sure the government would have been able to carry out what they're doing now without JDC being there to behind the scenes to get them to think about it, but also to actually mobilize it. So this is like, it's really exciting to be able to work in such a pivotal place that has such impact on such important things.
That's true, and we really appreciate that. We really appreciate JDC and the great job we are doing.
And Moniam, thank you for all the work that you're doing in your community, because none of this work could happen without activists like you. And it's really important for me and for us to hear your story. And I hope that we can continue learning from you. And I want to thank Michal and Shauna and Moniam for joining us for such a powerful conversation. Something that came in the chat during while we were talking is this issue feels immense. It is immense. And this is only the story of asylum seekers in Israel. So I want to point everyone again to the 70 million campaign that Olam is running right now. They're trying to put together resources and learnings and ways that you can take action in one convenient place. So I strongly encourage you we'll post a link in the chat to check out the 70 million campaign, pledge your support, and also Olam is hosting a live webinar on Facebook tomorrow at 11 a.m., which we hope you can join as well, to dig even deeper into this conversation and learn more about refugees around the world. And again, I will be sending out an email this week with a ton of resources that Shauna has put together for us, and even more just about this topic, because there's just so much to learn. Thank you to our audience for tuning in and for learning along with us. I hope you can join us this Friday for a Shabbat celebration with Entwine at 1 p.m. Eastern time. You can see a lot more of our programs online on the thread. We also have some opportunities on there for you to volunteer with communities abroad, which I hope you'll look into. And I hope to see you at our next exclusive. It was really wonderful. Thank you again to our panelists. Thank you to our audience. And just we appreciate everything that you do. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.